Welcome back to another hour of You're Hired. I'm your host, Lauren Epstein. Today, we're going to be talking about unconscious bias in the workplace. And if you've been listening to our show for a while, you remember we had Howard Ross and his wife on a few months back talking about unconscious bias. And we're addressing it again because it is such an important issue. And I've got some great guests. Before I do, I want to make sure that you know that our sponsor, our amazing sponsor, yearup.org, is a great organization that takes people 18 to 25 and gives them 6 months of hands-on technical training and then provides them a 6-month internship, which is a great way to get people employed who are not going to college. So if you're an employer and you're looking for a way to hire people that you're sure are qualified, this is a great program to get involved with. So you want to go to yearup.org. That's yearup.org. And if you want to follow us, you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren Epstein. You can also join us on Facebook at You're Hired Radio. And if you missed the live cast, you can always go to our Mixcloud account at mixcloud.com and search on You're Hired Radio. And if you're interested in being on the show, you can give us a buzz at 240-876-0276. We always love your show ideas. Thank you again for listening. So today I have with me two very special guests, Monica Oldham. Monica, am I pronouncing your name last right?
Yes.
It's Oldham?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
She is a senior specialist in the Diversity and Inclusion Office at the World Bank. She's responsible for developing and delivering the diversity and inclusion curriculum across the bank and coaches senior leaders for inclusion. Monica has over 30 years of experience in the area of human capital, and we welcome her to the show.
Thank you.
And also we have Dr. Karyn Trader-Leigh. Welcome, Karyn.
Good morning.
Karyn is the CEO and co-owner of Karyn Trader and Associates Global Partners, where she serves as the diversity strategy leader. For 25 years, Karyn has supported organizations in increasing cultural competencies, managing the impact of unconscious bias, and addressing practices that replicate unequal systems. Katie, your Twitter is KTA Global? Mm-hmm. That's KTA Global if you want to follow Karyn. So unconscious bias is becoming a much more popular term, and I think I want to just comment socially. It seems like when we had our last election, several times Hillary Clinton, who was running for president, said unconscious bias. And I don't think a lot of people understood what that means. I think also when they hear the word bias, they think of something bad. And that's a myth that I hope we can dispel in our conversation today. And I've actually been learning about this. So last summer when we first started our show, I did a piece. This is actually the third piece on diversity and inclusion in the workplace we did. And I got schooled because, you know, in my thinking as a recruiter for the last 20 years, to me, diversity was gender and, orientation, color, nationality. But I never really thought of diversity as diversity of thought, diversity of background, and that's really what it represents. So I think there's two things we're going to talk about, and then also inclusion, which was another eye-opener for me. Someone showed me this great picture. It was like on one side of the picture, you had a bowl of fruit with all the pieces together. So you had the apples together, the oranges together, the pears together, and that was diversity. And then inclusion when it was all mixed together. So inclusion is, and then we'll talk about that as well. So Monica, I know you're working at the World Bank. So tell us, clearly the World Bank has a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and we can call it D&I for just the sake of shorthand. What do you see in the field right now? I mean, things have changed. You've been working for a while.
Within the bank specifically?
Well, within the bank, but also in the bank relative to the culture that we live in now.
Part of the thing with the bank is a lot of my American colleagues will say, well, you're already diverse because you have all these nationalities. We have people from over 170 different countries. And yes, we are diverse, but the challenge, which is also the beauty of working at the bank, is every single one of those countries has a different culture. And so how do you get all of these cultures to recognize the value of all the different cultures? So whether it's at the national level, tribal, regional, whatever. Everybody has their different issues within a country, but then how do you get everybody to work together, recognizing the value, and therefore recognizing and valuing the perspective, which is the inclusion piece. And that different from a lot of the different countries, so we're basically a little microcosm of what's going on in every single country around the world. So that's what makes it challenging, but it's also what makes it fun.
And when did you first kind of become aware of the notion of bias?
Unconscious or conscious?
Okay, well, let's start with conscious.
Okay, I would say conscious bias from when I was small. Being a Black woman, you, as a child, you recognize when someone is biased against you for whatever reason. Unconscious bias, starting to do some of the research into it. You mentioned Howard Ross, and I've known Howard for years, and started following his work, but also the work of Daniel Kahneman. We had him at the bank a few years ago.
So for the folks who don't know, Daniel Kahneman wrote a book called Fast, Slow Thinking.
Yeah, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a great book on how our brains work around like the bias. Well, we'll talk about that, but he's a really great author.
Mm-hmm. So looking into those, but then working with some of our own internal behavioral economists. So what are some of the things, looking at the brain, that are causing you to take those shortcuts? And as we start looking at it from that standpoint, as opposed to, like you said, nobody wants to think of him or herself as biased because it just sounds wrong. So when you start looking at it from the brain and understanding, okay, this is what's going on, it makes the conversation much easier.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So what is bias as far as you perceive it to be?
To me, it's a shortcut. It's simply, cognitive economy. It is the brain taking a shortcut. I've known, put A plus B plus C has always equaled D, so I don't have to take the time to add them up this time. So when there's a truck coming towards me, I don't have to take the time to think, how much does that truck weigh? How much do I weigh? If I get out of the way at this speed or this speed or this speed, what will be the result? No, I get out of the way. Based on history and evolution, we take certain shortcuts. But the problem is when we take those shortcuts based on things that we absolutely know are true that may not be true. So whether it's dealing with any of the dimensions of diversity that we normally think of or anything else in decision-making, when we have those shortcuts that we might need to question because maybe this time it's a little bit different.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's kind of showed up in the workplace, which most social issues show up in the workplace first. That our brains, and for those of you who don't know, this has been my learning, is that we have the amygdala, which are actually two amygdala that are in your brain, and they're about the size of an almond, and all of your fast thinking happens there. So fast thinking, like Monica was saying about getting out of the way of a truck, but it's also if you're walking down the street and you see someone who looks like someone you like them. Conversely, if it's someone you don't like them. And that is derived from most of our development as beings of survival. Right. It was really important to us to survive. Most of our brain power goes to that kind of thinking. Right. If you could actually quantify it. Right. So it's just kind of part of all of us, right? Karen, what's been your experience with?
Another dimension I would add to bias, I think of it as probably our socialized learning in terms of preferences. So that it is, I have a preference for, I have a preference against. And so then it cuts across all of those human dimensions. Right. And, of course, all the things that you've already said, which is it can be positive or negative. And so my experience with bias and coming to understand it really, it's the same thing, childhood growing up, where you're socialized to recognize and understand it, is certainly as a minority in the U.S. culture, at least for my era of growing up, right? You get those messages. And you get those messages in overt ways and in unconscious ways from your family as well as from the society that you're in. So it's the whole notion of unconscious bias. For me, there's two dimensions. I think of it in two dimensions, and I think we talk about it most heavily from the dimension of the internal perspective and the brain, as you've articulated it. And I also think of it in a sense of, from a cultural level, that there is conscious and unconscious bias in terms of the socialization of cultures. And so I think we devote a lot of our time, necessarily so, especially in the workplace, to focusing on unconscious bias in terms of at the individual level of how people show up. But I don't think we do enough to get at the whole notion of collective consciousness or the unconscious bias at a collective level. And so, which gets us to systemic bias.
Right.
And so I think that that's something that we have to think of. For me, I like to think of the dual pieces of that.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's important.
I remember being a kid and recognizing bias growing up in Brooklyn. So the neighborhood I grew up in was predominantly white, Italian, and Jewish, some Irish. And going to school, I went to school with African-American kids. And in elementary school, it was great. I mean, it was just like it wasn't really present. But once I got to high school, I got mugged in high school 3 times. And each time was by either an individual or a group of African-American boys. And and I'd seen a lot of African-American on African-American crime, like right in front of me. There was one time where I was on a bus, and it was broad daylight. There's like 30 people on the bus. This woman comes on with her packages. She's standing right by the back door, and these 3 young kids, and everyone on the bus is African-American. I'm the only white kid. And they push her off the bus. Like right there, they push her off the bus and they take her bags, and I scream to the driver, like I get up, hey, like stop the bus. This lady just got pushed off, and nothing happened. And I thought, I must have been about 16 or so. I got up again and I said, hey, and then I can't really quite say exactly why I felt this way, but I felt like everyone was like, sit down, shut up. And so I just sat down. And those experiences really, and plus growing up in Brooklyn in the 70s, all the television was, the news would talk about this black person did crime against whomever. So it was really part of the cultural thing that there was a danger here. And I know now that it isn't factual. It's what happened to me. And I've done a lot of work to kind of heal it outside of this bias conversation, because I do have a commitment to justice and my own personal growth, and I know the value of human beings. But those are the things that I've had to overcome in kind of coming to like, oh yeah, it's just a person, right? I mean, there are good people and bad people, and it's the way it is. And just I'm gonna just one last story, because this was like, again, the pull in my brain. I was on another bus. It was the middle of the night with like 3. It was me and then these 2 other young, older but young men, and the bus was pulling up to a stop like in the middle of nowhere. And this woman started banging on the door, and they opened it up. The driver opened it up, and she says, someone just mugged me. And these 2 white kids just ran out the door after these muggers. So it all those things at a formative age were not helpful, I think, in learning, what the value of people are.
Yeah. Those are also difficult times in terms of looking at that in a historical context. The end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s was a time of black rage, for sure. And it doesn't justify your experience and what happened to you by any stretch of the imagination. But the 70s, New York had a lot of gangs by block. But in terms of what was going on in terms of black life, you had I was in college then, so, I remember us communicating with the other colleges, the kids who took over at Columbia and who were stood on the steps, and, it was an era of the Panthers.
Right.
I lived in New Haven. Bobby Seale was in New Haven. I had to cross the street on my way to high school because the Panther headquarters was not far from where I lived, and so it was a time of rage. And in some unfortunate ways, I think oftentimes because of a lot of the experiences of that young black youth have, crime becomes an economy. And so there's a lot of very difficult issues that need resolving by the society that are more than just a black problem. And I don't think we get to addressing that as such. But I have a great appreciation for when you have an experience like that and you come to grow to be able to see a bigger humanity and the bigger issues as a result of having an experience like that. And I think that's the thing we have to do in terms of growing up, having experienced racism all our lives. I can't live in a tunnel like that and not have friends across the spectrum of humanity because I had that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about, and I want to hear from you about this, Monica, but the notion now, and I would like the listeners to understand this, about unconscious bias and awareness is not about Black people or white people or men or about women. It's about, we're finally seeing about why it is we make these quick decisions that exclude people or include people, and particularly in the hiring process and the work process, that sometimes aren't in our best judgment. Right? I mean, sometimes we'll hire somebody because they look right, but they end up not being the right person, and vice versa.
And it builds on your point about the socialization, because with your experience, Lauren, having seen those things and experiencing them, then that created that pattern in your head. That's what we're talking about. That if I'm around Black people, this is what's going to happen. This would happen in the past, so chances are it's going to happen in the future. So when you first meet somebody, there's that little feeling in your gut, and you may not think of where that's coming from. But as you've done your own personal development, you start looking at, what are my experiences? What's in my background? Why did I just think? Why did I just feel what I just did? But I think that too many people don't take the time to examine that. If you first meet somebody in an interview and you have that first, oh, wow, I really like that person. Who is that person reminding you of? Or is there some experience that you can think back to? Or, oh, I just don't like that guy.
So what you're talking about is how to recognize bias.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, but if it's a quick response, is that what you're saying?
Yes. If it's a quick response when you first meet somebody, it's coming from somewhere. It might be a good place, it might be a bad place. But if I just met you, then obviously my reaction to you can't be from you. Because
Right.
again, I just met you.
Right.
So that bias could be for you because you remind me of somebody that I like, or a pleasant experience or something. If it's a bad reaction, it could be because of a bad experience or somebody bad in my history. But that's where that pattern's coming from. That's where that unconscious bias comes from.
So how would you distinguish between intuition, like a gut feel, right? We all know what the gut feel is, and bias.
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
No, because the intuition is
Just another word.
To me, it is, because you can have a mental intuition, you can have a physical, but it's all, where is that coming from? Something is telling me that there's something going on.
And it's an opportunity
To examine it.
Yeah. And I want just to go back to the brain for a moment in terms of just what you're saying, patterns. The brain is a pattern matching machine.
Right.
Okay. And so even at some, I believe in multiple levels of intuition, but some aspect of intuition is, shaped by past experience and then sense of knowingness, so you get the integration, I think, of both of those. But even, sometimes even your intuition can be off.
Right. So you talked about something, the collective consciousness. I want to talk about this because I am a believer in the collective consciousness. I have, I mean, obviously I've been around a while, but I have clients and folks that I've coached, and they'll say things to me like, oh, I feel fill in the blank, or I think I'm not this. And I ask them, where'd that come from? And when you really uncover it, it's like, oh, I don't know. Like there's not really a real answer. And I believe that human beings, because I believe that we're all connected. Like there's this, I don't know if it's physical, but there's this metaphysical manifestation of how we're attached. And that consciousness is kind of like when you're sad, you're feeling the sadness or the pain of the collective, right? When I think I'm not worthy because I'm a woman, it's not your story. It's the story that we're shared. Do you think that this is part of bias?
I think that there might be part of it in terms of, assumptions. What are the assumptions? What are the limitations that we're putting on ourselves that we don't own? So with women who have been told a story that they're not worthy, they may have been told that directly, but it may be as simple as, what sort of messages are we giving young girls? when we're giving them, the young girls, T-shirts that say you're a rock star and, be a beauty queen, and we're giving the young boys T-shirts that say be a scientist and exercise your brain, those are messages that we're sending. And so it has to have an impact somewhere. So whether it's a direct experience that people have, or like you said, this is what society, it's that culture, that culture, those cultural messages that are out there. And I think that has an impact not just on the collective conscious, but the collective unconscious. What are the overall messages that we're putting out there? What are the shortcuts that we're creating in everybody's brain?
Right.
Yeah, so I agree.
Because there are common shared thoughts, right? We all think a lot of the same things.
And so I want to be careful to make the distinction as I think about collective consciousness as a distinction from sort of the metaphysical sense of it, although there's an element of it, and then the collective consciousness that as a social patterns that we get to create and shape as cultures and society. So, if you the collective consciousness of a nation is shaped, for example, if I use the example of Russia, and not because they're in the news right now, but I'm reading a book called Secondhand Time. But if you look at the history of the kind of political structure that they have and how that shapes the collective consciousness, if you looked at notions of historical trauma, take the Holocaust, take slavery, that is a collective consciousness that if you were in that culture that you carry and is inscribed on you. Democracy is a collective consciousness because it then is the assumptions and it's the beliefs and it's sort of the metacognitive of the society that we live in that then for me, imprints on our conscious and our unconscious minds, and then is shaping those belief systems and those values. And it gets embedded in our unconscious. It becomes narrative. It becomes mythology. And then you have the force of what is the dominant mythology, which may mitigate against your interests as gender, or as race or religion or LGBT. And so then you're railing against that collective conscious understanding to the degree that we don't focus on the forces that structure that, the policies, the procedures, the practices, in terms of really naming that level of structuration of a culture and a society, that it then continues to then, for me, replicate on equal systems.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So we're kind of getting a sense of how this bias kind of plays. How do folks listening identify the biases? You said kind of the first thought, but what are other things that we can do to say, oh, that's a bias? So one, we're already said, hey, look, biases aren't bad. We all have biases. That is just a way of making a shortcut decision. And the thing I wanted to address was that we make the quick decisions with our amygdala, but the more thoughtful decisions are with our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's in the front, that's executive thinking. And it's like when you really think about something. If I gave you a math problem talking about Kahneman, like 22 times 36, you're going to use the front part of your brain. So what can people do to notice when something is a bias or not a bias? And then we'll talk about what they can do about it.
I think processes and practices, and always not easy, but on the most basic level for me, it is often watching someone I'm talking to, because I can, the emotional intelligence component can tell me that I just said something that may not have sat well. I just saw a reaction. I just saw a look or a body movement. And so for me, that the recognition of that is an opportunity for inquiry. And so to say, did I say something that struck you oddly? And I'm curious. I saw a reaction in you, and I'm curious about what that reaction is. So there's one piece of response that's curiosity, in terms of being willing to be curious and not just sort of mortally wedded to your point of view. If you want to even just grow. That's, I think, one piece of it. So let's go back and forth on that. I don't want to just kind of reel off a bunch of things, but let's sort of go back and forth on that.
And I would say another one is to have your own, in a previous job, we referred to it as your own personal board of directors. is there somebody that you trust to point out your blind spots or your patterns? So we had one person at work, for instance, a male manager, and his team pointed out that he had a bias toward women, where the past several hires he kept hiring women. And he hadn't noticed it because it was one hire at a time. But they pointed out the pattern, and then when he started examining it, he looked at his own history and realized all of his sisters. He really respected his sisters. He had several sisters, and he saw women in that light. So it wasn't until somebody pointed that out to him that he thought, oh, okay, I really need to look at this. Am I looking at the gender question differently when I'm doing hiring? So do you have those trusted individuals? Hey, did you know that you always do this? No, I really hadn't noticed it. So have somebody who you trust and who can give you the bad news as well as the good news.
So it sounds like, just to kind of get a sense, and I'd like to get more into this, is one, dialogue. Have dialogue with people when you recognize, and have dialogue with yourself, and then have feedback mechanisms, right? There has to be feedback mechanisms. Yeah. But how would I recognize that I even need a feedback mechanism?
Are you human?
I think so.
If you're human, you're biased. If you have a brain, you're biased.
Okay, so this is really for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
So for the 5 people who are listening, you better be doing this.
So that be the ability to be the other side of curiosity is to be open to inquiry.
Absolutely.
So that, guys, I can sit here and sit like, with an attitude and with my hand up is, which is what my body language is conveying, that says I'm not open to inquiry. And so to be open to inquiry, especially on a subject that has been the third rail that we don't talk about, and that I know when I do this work that many white colleagues, I can sit there and watch them go red, and I know how difficult and uncomfortable the conversation is, and yet to help them get to a space of being able to talk about it, because it then lives in that unconscious, unspoken state, but yet it is recognized. And so, to be able to be open to inquiry, which then allows for exploring your assumptions and beliefs, and someone asking you, well, why do you think that? Why do you believe that? What's the assumption that you're making about that? And so that makes it a little bit more testable. So someone can also present a different set of data than the data that your life experience has led you to believe and see, that there may be some other causality, there may be another reason, there may be another viewpoint or belief system that may be totally different than your experience. So I think that is also a part of that.
And Monica, how have you brought these conversations up in the World Bank in a workplace? How do you start the dialogue?
Part of it is we've started doing a series of workshops. And all of these things that we're talking about are what we have in the workshop. But we started off by presenting different patterns that show people, okay, we're talking about bias, but we're talking that bias is that pattern. It's neither negative, it's neither positive. There's no emotion attached to it. And then as people start to recognize, okay, maybe there is something going on here. Now, how do we bring it down? How do we examine our backgrounds, examine what our personal biases are? How do we take it forward? What does it look like within the workplace, within our workplace in particular? Now, how can we do something as an individual?
Let's talk about that. So you started breaking it down. So one, how are people recognizing it? And what are they doing?
One of the things, and this is the workshop, and we actually purchased this and brought it in, is we start off with a simulation. And it's a hiring decision where each team gets to work on at an individual level, look at a candidate, and then as they go through and they realize, okay, there's something going on here, without giving away any of the secrets of the simulation, just in case any of the listeners haven't gone through the workshop yet. But after the simulation, that opens their eyes. So that, through a series of videos, series of exercises, is, okay, we're not talking about prejudice. We're not talking about discrimination. It's getting away from those sorts of terms. And to your point, when people come in, and they very much, I can see people with the crossed arms, the make me learn, I'm not prejudiced. I don't know why I'm here. And at the very beginning, when I asked them, what are your associations with the word bias? Prejudice, discrimination, unfair. Very few people say patterns. Very few people say anything positive. It's usually something very negative. So that by the end of the workshop, people will, well, what else can I do? Not, well, what can I do about it? It's, okay, I know some things. What else can I do? But it's getting people to recognize you have to do your own work. You can't make anybody else unbiased. You have to start with yourself and then work on from there. Because some of the people coming in, well, my boss is biased. What can I do about him? Nothing. Not a thing. You can work on your own.
He's broken. Right. Fix him. Come fix him.
It's not about me. It's about my boss.
Yeah.
No, we're here to work on your work.
Well, it's easier to see what's wrong with someone else.
Mm-hmm. Always.
Right.
I read an interesting article about a project this week that company is Rockwell, and they have started running training for white men around changing their attitudes and understanding bias exclusively for white males, so that they could recognize it. And it was at the CEO. They recognize the challenge that they have in the workforce. It's a STEM organization, and people see what the future is, and it does not bode well unless we begin to address these issues and these barriers for women and people of color, just because of who the population is. And so they've started doing some training because they need the white males at all levels of the organization, especially that are in management, to begin to do something more than they have done around growing women and growing people of color and understanding the challenges. And so a lot of the unconscious bias training for them was to begin to recognize that if they were not a white male, that there really are a set of very unique challenges that you run into just in the notion of fit. Mm-hmm. And how cultures judge fit as often an unspoken characteristic or quality that people are looking for in the interview process. And so it's their way of beginning to really both, driving it into performance appraisal, holding managers accountable, but in a very positive kind of way, helping the managers to become more effective coaches and mentors and developers of human talent, no matter what the package is in, but getting a real handle specifically on these issues so that they know how to navigate this and how to do something with it, and that they can see it and understand it. And so I think that was pretty courageous, but it also recognizes the reality that we so often have put that burden on the people who are victimized by it to be the ones to lead it, and they can't make all that change by themselves.
They don't have the power.
So the listeners know I've been working at the U.S. Forest Service for the last year, and I put together an unconscious bias workshop based on the request from the head of HR for the Forest Service, and I gave it to the 40 HR leaders. And so I put this together. I do a lot of training, but I never worked on this subject. And that's when I read Howard's book. And in delivering this, it was it's a diverse group of people, probably more women than men. But it was interesting what came up, and the sharing, without divulging exactly what was said, was really emotional and from a very long time ago about where these biases were coming from, and from really serious traumatic events that we would agree that's not the kind of thing you'd want to have happen to someone. And it really kind of made me aware of how what we do in our lives has an effect for a long time, but also the courage that the HR director had to even attempt to talk about this. Because I think folks are kind of like, in the Forest Service, the hiring for all the diversity categories has been going down the last 5 years. So what they would do is they would say, okay, we're going to hire an African-American man, and we're going to put him in this forest where there are no African-Americans. And that didn't work out, that made the folks in that forest think, this is diversity, this doesn't work. It's not the right way to do it. Well, how do we actually make it work? And it's not about putting an African-American man in a forest that's predominantly staffed by white people. It's a different mindset. And that's what I hope the listeners can take away. So, one of the things that business leaders do is they make decisions based on how's this going to affect my bottom line? And how do you see this affecting the bottom line in organizations?
I'd like to go back to what you'd said earlier in terms of how you looked at diversity originally. So gender, race, nationality, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and how we need to look at diversity in terms of the different perspective and experiences people bring in and all of their various dimensions that go into that. So we're both Black women, but we have very different experiences, so we're very diverse. But if somebody just look at us, they say, oh, they're exactly alike. No, we have very different experiences, and so our perspectives. And to answer your question, in terms of the bottom line, if you keep getting the same people in, you're going to keep getting the same results. But your problems of your customers are going to be different. So if you don't recognize that there's value in these different perspectives, you're not going to be able to address your clients' issues. And where those biases come in is if I keep thinking that only somebody from Yale or Harvard has the answer, then I'm going to keep getting those same results. So I need to start looking at what am I not looking at? What about my background, about my patterns in terms of the right fit might be getting in the way? Because the person might have been fit for purpose for a previous purpose, but not for the future purpose.
Right. So a couple of things I wanted to say about that. One, the S&P 500, 75% of those companies are gone, right, every 10 or 15 or 20 years. Mm-hmm. I know at the World Bank how we connected, Jeremy was saying that they want to send someone from that country to that country. And that's a bias because, you like if you're in a country, let's say an African country, and they send white Europeans to come solve their problems, it's not as effective as if you send someone from that country who understands the culture, who understands the bigger picture.
But by the same token, it's also not saying that only somebody from that country is going to understand it. If you look at it, for instance, in India, you have the North and the South. So it's going to be very, very different, people coming from the North versus the South. If you only say, well, you're Indian, so you're going in, and the person's from the North, but the issues they're dealing with are in the South, then you might as well have sent in somebody from Europe because it's very, very different.
Yeah.
So it's understanding those cultural differences, but also the perspectives. If you bring in somebody from the country who had a very upper-class upbringing, and you're sending them in to deal with poverty issues, the person may not understand it. That was not that person's experience in the country.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody else who was poor in a different country may have more of an understanding of what's going on with that particular client.
I'm digressing, but I think poverty is a great point for people listening. A lot of my friends who have never experienced poverty think that poverty is somehow a choice, right?
Just like skin color.
Right. Like, so you're poor because you don't work hard. You don't have these things because you don't work hard. You should go to school, not understanding that in the system that they were in, their success was unavoidable. It was written Malcolm Gladwell wrote in Blink that basically, however you are, your kids are going to be the same way. It's kind of unavoidable. There's not a whole lot of delta, right? And the reason is that you have these very strong biases that decide all the decisions that you're going to be making.
So today we can get to see that that's quite not so in such a big way as we watch the collapse of the middle class and we see poverty dramatically increasing because for any number of reasons like automation and job work disappearing or whether it's overseas or not. So folks it is not by choice that they are impoverished. And those who have been historically marginalized, they end up having a double dose of that. So we often look at those things in very simplistic ways in terms of understanding the meaning of poverty and how it affects different subcultures within our country.
Yeah, I think we haven't really solved a lot of the problems in this country because of bias. And I think, 40 years, when Lyndon Johnson was the president and we started to kind of support people in a different way with social services, that worked then and that may not work now. There's this really strong belief that somehow having a lot of military keeps us safe, which is in fact not the case. We get into wars and somehow that's noble. And I think that's just like this bias when we have so many other things that would really make our country stronger by not having a bias towards we have to have a strong military, the strongest upon the strongest upon the strongest militaries. It doesn't pan out in reality. And I think, again, it's that bias of how we feel about things. We don't really look at the data. We don't get feedback from our executive board.
Yeah, so that one is when we have a bias toward power and force.
Yeah.
And so, and for me, that represents also a very male way of thinking. And so that's, so that's kind of a global narrative,
Sure.
Which then becomes, why it does become compelling to bring women around the world to the table to have conversation. And so, and you see that to me in some of the things that when places like the UN advocates for in emerging economies and developing countries to educate women and bring them to the table, it's because it changes the life for the whole family, for the whole nation when you have both of those forces together. And so, that says for me that there are a lot of bottom lines. And the bottom way, when we talk about the bottom line, even in the United States, we have to look at that in a broader concept than just the fiduciary bottom line and the payoff to stakeholders, because in a service economy, if that's what it is, and then we have everybody poor and they can't buy and they can't purchase, well, it is going to affect your bottom line. So then it is necessary to have a greater social consciousness, and I think that is happening for corporations, that they do have to pay attention to those issues and what's going on in the world and the society around them, and if there's high unemployment, and do we need skills training, and how do we bring this diverse population to the table, because we're going to need those employees. And right. I think the military is an excellent example of an institution that has come to recognize it, because it's a strategic threat if we don't invest in education, in STEM, where all of this next population is coming from that's so incredibly undereducated. And so we have to look at the bottom line in a much broader way, I think, as a society than just taking care of shareholders.
And there's data that says that if companies are more diverse, they make more money. And I don't have it with me to cite, but
sure.
There's research. They've been looking
Absolutely.
at this for a while, and it's like if you're an owner of a business, you should have a really diverse workforce. You'll have better results.
Well, and also when you look at the global environment of the workforce, the global face, everybody's coming from everywhere now. So if you keep trying to, say in this country, if you still keep trying to hire white men, just from evolution, there are less and less and less. And so if all companies are doing it, it's a much smaller talent pool. So why would you not have that larger talent pool?
In 25 years, one of the reasons the Forest Service wanted to get onto this diversity kick is because in 25 years, the majority of Americans will not be white. That's just a fact. So if you're not already engaging in diverse hiring and understanding this thing, your business is going to be left behind. You'll be that 75% of companies that aren't around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting piece that I always think that we have to also talk about it in ways and educate in ways that it does not feel like a threat, and that we don't wield it as a threat, because that's what creates backlash.
Yes.
And so, that's that place where, for me, that we do have to learn to speak and recognize humanity in a much broader sort of way, and just get us behind the shield of our ethnicity, but also stop creating a world where that's how you do have to play.
Right.
And so, because, it's we have to take that threat of how society and how the world is changing. And it doesn't mean that you or I become an endangered species or that you become an endangered species, because it's that kind of threatening. And that's the concern I have for some of the dynamics I think that we see at play in the United States today.
Yeah, the othering. Yeah. We do a lot of othering.
Absolutely.
Yes, a lot of
Absolutely.
that, yes.
Like, so there's 4 people in this room, right? There's me and my 2 guests in Afote. We're 4 human beings in this room.
Right.
There's not 2 women, 2 men. I mean, I could say that, but that doesn't help me.
No, it just keeps you going in this never-ending cycle, and so we keep talking about our difference rather than our commonalities.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to the show, we're talking about unconscious bias. You're listening to 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. I'm your host, Lauren Epstein, and I have with me my awesome guests, been talking about some really cool stuff, Monica and Karyn. So let's talk about some of the solutions. What's your pie in the sky vision of how this can all play? Oh, look, they all smiled. What's your pie in the sky vision of how this can play out for us as our culture? Because you're clearly, this is your life's work. I mean, you're doing this for a reason. How do you see it?
Yeah. You want to jump in? Go ahead.
I think that to your point earlier, Karyn, about that self-discovery, that curiosity, that self-curiosity, if we would have more people to have that, to be open, everybody recognized nobody's perfect. Okay, then what can I do about me? Stop doing the other. Well, I'm not getting ahead because Lauren is the one he took my job. No, he didn't take your job. He took the job. So stop thinking that there's this scarcity. Think more in terms of, a land of plenty, that everybody has the opportunity, so everybody gets a chance to compete. And if it's not this one, then the next one. But doing more of that self-discovery and that open curiosity, having those conversations, if we have more conversations from the middle than from the opposite ends, I think we'd have a little bit more understanding of each other, but then also starting to look at where am I coming from? Having that, start thinking about thinking. Slow down our thinking so we can start thinking about, I just had a quick reaction to Lauren and a great reaction to Karyn. Where did that come from? If we all did a little bit more of that self-discovery and then talked about it, I think we'd be in a much better place.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to value my culture because there's something rich about it, and I want to know about yours. I want to be a navigator and an explorer of other cultures and see what it is that I can take away, learn, understand, because it is when we're in that's what innovation is that we get to cross borders. That's why that is one of the great things about who this nation has been and evolved to be, is because of that. And so touching the richness of that. But I also want us to really explore the structural processes, the legislation, the policies, the practices that are coded practices into systems that were built on the foundations of different principles. I want us to also be able to deconstruct that so that we then don't continue to have racism, ethnocentrism, bias, homophobia that's just without homophobics, without racist, without sexist, because it is built into the structure and the system that we have. And so I think that we also have to be willing to take risks to do things differently. If our process for hiring is based on some best practices that get you and yield you this particular kind of result. And yet when you look at that, it so profoundly screens out a whole set of experiences and capabilities and equivalencies that you're not willing to really pull apart and look at the system and the results it continues to produce, which is to continue to produce inequalities. And so, today for me, I also have to think about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And equity is not affirmative action. I do not mean affirmative action when I say equity, but I do mean that there is that if I'm looking at infant mortality, the equity it's not a function of your race. It's a function of a bunch of other things, but it is not race. And so it's like bringing that kind of balance to the system. And so, so that's a vision, for me. That's a desire, is that we're able to push through some of that stuff, and that we all have the capability of looking at it in that kind of a way. Not just me, because I'm a diversity practitioner and I'm an African American and I'm a woman. I need other people. I think we all have to have those kind of skill sets, because it's such a fundamental part of the American story that we have the structures that we have.
Some of the things, because we're running out of time, but I wanted to just touch on how can people stop their bias in the moment. So one of the things that I've learned is that if you breathe, Now, a lot of people do meditation. Meditation is basically just paying attention to your breath. But if you just start breathing slowly, you activate your prefrontal cortex and deactivate your amygdala. Thank you. So that's something that people can do. What else can people do, like just real quick?
So I like that. That's the somatics for me. And that is going inside your body and feeling something. And I got this flash in the pit of my stomach, or I feel I'm flushing. Why am I flushing all of a sudden? What was just said that made me uncomfortable?
And by flushing, you mean face getting red?
Yes. I feel my heat rising, okay? Or just you may feel it inside. You're not going to see my red rise, but I'll feel it, And so it is, I think that's a very powerful, when you talk about meditation or slowing down, that piece of going slow. What are the things that trigger me in the moment that I know that I can have some control over and have also developed some internal discipline to also not always be reactive in terms of my emotions on something that hooks me.
And to build on that, just remember, we're always all at choice. You choose how you respond to something. You're always going to react to something, but you choose how you respond and then take responsibility for your response.
Cool. So, Monica, how can folks get a hold of you if they're interested in talking to you?
Through the World Bank Group.
Do you want to share an email address or a way to contact you, or just Moldham, MOLDHAM at worldbankgroup.org. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And Karyn, how can folks get a hold of you?
CEO at KTA Global Partners, plural, awesome. .com. So be delighted.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and talking to us about unconscious bias. We at the show support your visions for a world that has a more awareness of bias, right? We can talk
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks for having us.
Conscious bias, that people understand what's going on. Yeah. Thanks again for listening to You're Hired. My name is Lauren Epstein. I've been your host. Hopefully you'll come back next week and hear another edition. Have a great week.